The sixth slap didn't just ring through the cold marble foyer of our Greenwich estate. It shattered the 10-year illusion of the quiet, obedient woman my husband thought he had married. Julian didn't even blink as my head hit the mahogany side table, blood warm and metallic filling my mouth, while the heavy rain pounded against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing beside him was his mother, Evelyn, holding a pair of heavy brass keys and staring down at me with absolute contempt, while Julian's younger sister, Clara, casually sipped her espresso, like this was just another Tuesday afternoon entertainment. "Get up, sign the surrender of your grandfather's trust, and pack your bags before I call security to drag you out into the street," Julian barked, his voice laced with the arrogant authority of a man who believed he held every single card in his hands. He tossed a pen onto my bruised lap, unaware that the ring sitting quietly on my thumb was registered to the very holding company that owned the mortgage on his firm, his luxury cars, and the roof currently keeping him dry. I looked up through swollen eyes, feeling the cold marble press against my cheek, and realized that for 10 agonizing years, I had let them treat me like a penniless orphan begging for crumbs at their table. They thought I was a fragile charity case with no family and no financial leverage, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet estate lawyer who managed their entire corporate empire reported directly to me. I reached out, slowly picked up the pen, and snapped it cleanly in half right in front of Julian's polished leather shoes, watching his face twist into sudden, uncontrollable rage. "If you walk out that door without signing, you leave with absolutely nothing and you will sleep in a shelter tonight," Evelyn spat, taking a step forward to kick my leather handbag toward the open threshold. I stood up, wiping the streak of red from my lip with the back of my hand, and looked Julian dead in the eye as the ice-cold rain rushed inside, wetting the hem of my coat. He thought he was throwing out a broken, defeated wife, completely unaware that by forcing me out tonight, he had just triggered the catastrophic default clause on everything he owned. The rain outside was relentless, turning the long drive of the Greenwich estate into a blurred river of black asphalt. As I stepped over the threshold, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, the deadbolt clicking into place with a sharp, final metallic snap. I stood on the wet gravel for a long moment, the storm soaking through my coat within seconds, yet the freezing water felt strangely clean against my burning face. My phone vibrated in my pocket, displaying a single unread text from Evelyn letting me know that any attempt to return would be met with an immediate restraining order. I didn't reply, walking slowly toward the iron gates where a black sedan was already idling quietly in the dark. Inside the car sat Marcus Vance, the senior partner of Vance and Sterling Legal, a man who had managed the vast real estate portfolio of the Sterling family for over 30 years. He passed me a dry towel and a warm thermos without saying a word, his sharp eyes lingering for a second on the purple bruise already swelling along my jawline. "Julian believes he signed a standard prenup 7 years ago," Marcus said quietly as the driver pulled away toward Manhattan. "He has no idea that the prenup was drawn against a subsidiary trust that expired the moment he committed a material breach of marital conduct." I leaned my head against the cool glass window, watching the grand estates of Fairfield County fade into the stormy night. For 7 years, I had deliberately played the role of Eleanor Vance, the timid, soft-spoken wife who shrank into the background at every high-society gala. When I met Julian at a charitable fundraiser in Boston, I was still recovering from the sudden loss of my grandfather, Arthur Sterling. My grandfather had built an empire in commercial shipping and institutional real estate, but he was a deeply private man who mistrusted public displays of wealth. Before he passed, he placed the entirety of the Sterling holdings into a private umbrella trust, instructing me to live a normal life and learn the true character of people before revealing the weight of my inheritance. When Julian proposed, he thought he was rescuing a modest interior designer with a modest pedigree. His mother, Evelyn, made it her personal mission from day one to remind me of my place in their refined world. She controlled the family dynamic with an iron fist, constantly contrasting my quiet nature with the prominent families of New York. Every dinner party became an exercise in subtle humiliation, where my clothes, my speech, and my background were dissected under the guise of helpful advice. I tolerated it all because I genuinely loved Julian, and believed that my patients would eventually forge a real family out of their cold ambition. Julian's family firm, Vance Capital, was an investment vehicle that looked impressive on the surface, with gleaming offices in Midtown and glossy feature articles in financial magazines. But beneath the polished facade lay a desperate need for capital. Over the last 3 years, Julian had taken massive risks in commercial development, overextending the firm's credit lines to fund speculative high-rises in Brooklyn. Whenever pressure mounted at work, he brought the tension home, his voice growing sharper, his demands more unreasonable. I began noticing small, deliberate changes in how he handled our shared accounts, gradually removing my name from household utilities and shifting property titles. Under the corporate structure of Vance Capital, I allowed him to do it, convincing myself that giving him financial control would ease his anxiety and restore peace to our marriage. I even stayed silent when his sister, Clara, demanded that I vacate the guest house on our estate so she could use it as a private studio for her failing lifestyle brand. Clara treated the domestic staff with open cruelness and treated me like an unpaid housekeeper, often leaving stacks of unpaid personal bills on my desk with scribbled notes expecting me to handle them. I paid them from my modest personal allowance, avoiding conflict at every turn because I held on to the naive hope that humility would eventually win their respect. The turning point began 3 months ago during the annual Vance Capital Gala at the Plaza Hotel. I was sitting at the head table next to Evelyn when Julian stood up to announce a major new partnership with an offshore development group. As he raised his glass, I noticed a striking woman sitting 2 seats down, wearing a vintage emerald necklace that had belonged to Julian's grandmother, a piece Evelyn had told me was locked safely in a vault for Julian's future children. The woman was Victoria Montgomery, the daughter of a prominent hedge fund manager whose capital Julian was desperately trying to secure for his struggling Brooklyn project. Throughout the evening, Evelyn treated Victoria with the warm, affectionate deference she had always denied me, while Julian hardly acknowledged my presence at the table. When we returned home that night, I calmly asked Julian why Victoria was wearing his family's heirloom necklace. He unbuttoned his cuffs with sharp, irritated motions, scoffing at my question as if I were a child questioning an adult decision. Victoria's father is bringing $50 million to the table for the Brooklyn site, Julian said, his eyes cold and unblinking. If giving her access to family jewelry closes the deal, then that is what happens. So stop acting like a jealous neurotic over things you don't understand. That night was the first time I felt a cold, deep shift in my chest, realizing that my silence had not been mistaken for patience, but for absolute weakness. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the house turned icy. Julian stopped coming home for dinner, claiming endless board meetings and late-night negotiations with foreign investors. Meanwhile, Evelyn began visiting the estate unannounced, accompanied by appraisers and interior decorators, who walked through the rooms as if I were already invisible, measuring spaces and discussing major renovations. When I confronted Evelyn in the garden one afternoon about why external designers were evaluating our private residence, she simply smiled a tight, cruel smile and told me that the family was making necessary adjustments for the future of Vance Capital. I started keeping a detailed journal of every transaction, every late-night absence, and every odd document Julian asked me to sign. 2 weeks ago, he brought home a thick stack of corporate papers, placing them on the kitchen island while I was preparing coffee. He told me they were routine waivers related to the estate's land zoning, pressing a pen into my hand and urging me to sign the signature tabs immediately so he could courier them back to his legal team. Instead of signing blindly, as I had done for years, I told him I wanted to review them overnight. Julian's face flushed with immediate anger, his hand coming down hard on the counter, demanding to know why I was suddenly questioning his authority on family matters. That refusal was the catalyst that accelerated their plan. Over the next several days, the pressure became unbearable, culminating in the sudden family gathering this evening, where Evelyn, Clara, and Julian trapped me in the foyer with a pre-drafted document surrendering all personal claims to the estate and any future spousal support. When I refused once more, stating clearly that I knew my rights, Julian lost control entirely, unleashing a barrage of physical violence that ended with 6 brutal slaps and my eviction into the storm. The sedan came to a smooth stop in front of a quiet, high-security residential building on the Upper East Side. Marcus turned in his seat, holding out a sleek black leather folder containing the master deeds of Sterling Enterprises and the complete financial dossier of Vance Capital. "We have verified every account," Marcus said, his voice grave. "Julian has spent the last 6 months pledging the Greenwich estate and his firm's equity as collateral for loans issued by our primary holding company, completely unaware that you are the sole managing director of that entity." I took the folder, feeling the weight of the papers in my lap as the elevator carried me up to the private penthouse my grandfather had left untouched for me. Standing in the brightly lit master bathroom, I looked into the mirror at the severe bruising across my face and the dried blood on my lip. The quiet, tolerant woman who had spent 7 years trying to buy love with silence was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus that had been dormant far too long. Julian thought he had thrown out a defenseless woman into the street with nothing to her name, completely oblivious to the fact that every single asset keeping his world afloat belonged to me. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to Betrayed, the Revenge channel. A simple like helps more people discover these stories, and your support inspires us to create new ones. Now, let's continue. I picked up my phone, dialed Marcus's direct line, and gave him the first clear command I had issued in 7 years. "Initiate the comprehensive audit of all Vance Capital debt covenants effective tomorrow morning at 8, I said calmly, watching my own steady reflection in the glass. "Do not notify their legal counsel until every single asset freeze is executed." The morning sun broke over Manhattan in sharp, icy rays, casting long shadows across the mahogany table in the conference room of Vance and Sterling Legal. I sat at the head of the table, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, watching Marcus spread out the complete forensic financial audit of Vance Capital. My face still bore the fading yellow-purple marks of Julian's violence, but the numbness of the previous night had been replaced by absolute clarity. Every piece of paper resting before me was a testament to how deeply my husband and his family had misunderstood the woman they had thrown into the rain. "Julian believes he is attending a routine investor update this morning at 10, Marcus said, sliding a thick blue binder across the glass surface. "What he does not know is that the lead institutional investor backing his $50 million Brooklyn high-rise project, Apex Horizon Holdings, is entirely owned by the Sterling Trust. When he mortgaged the Greenwich estate to secure his final credit line last month, he signed cross-default clauses that trigger immediately upon any unsanctioned asset transfer or fraudulent personal declaration." I opened the binder, scanning the rows of numbers, signatures, and bank routing details. Over the past 18 months, Julian had not just overextended his firm, he had systematically siphoned over $4 million from corporate development accounts into private entities controlled by Evelyn and Clara. A shell company registered under Clara's name had been receiving monthly advisory fees for non-existent marketing services, while Evelyn's personal accounts were being replenished directly from Vance Capital's payroll reserves. They weren't just running a business. They were treating a collapsing company like a private piggy bank while preparing to dump the legal liabilities onto me. At 9:15, my private investigator, a former federal agent named Richard Vance, no relation to Julian's family, entered the room and handed me a sealed envelope containing fresh photographic evidence. Yesterday afternoon, while Evelyn was lecturing me on my lack of value to the family, Julian was at a boutique jeweler on Madison Avenue purchasing a 4-carat diamond ring, using funds drawn from Vance Capital's primary operations account. The receipt showed it was billed as corporate office equipment, and the delivery address was Victoria Montgomery's private residence in Soho. They weren't just trying to cast me aside. They were preparing to replace me seamlessly, using the remaining capital of the firm to secure Victoria's high society backing before the House of Cards collapsed. I closed the folder slowly, feeling no surge of anger, only a profound, cold disgust for the sheer stupidity of their greed. Julian had spent 7 years convincing himself that he was an elite financial strategist, never realizing that his entire career had been built on loans, granted solely because lenders assumed he had access to my grandfather's legendary wealth. I instructed Marcus to initiate the formal default notices for Apex Horizon Holdings, effective at 11 o'clock that morning, precisely when Julian would be standing before his prospective board members. While he was pitching his grand vision for the Brooklyn development, the automatic bank freezes would sweep through every linked corporate account, locking down payroll, vendor lines, and personal credit facilities tied to Vance Capital. At 10:30, I took a private car down to the firm's office building in Midtown, accompanied by Marcus and 2 senior auditors. Walking through the polished glass doors of Vance Capital felt strangely distant, as if I were stepping onto a stage where a play I had already written was about to reach its second act. The receptionist looked up, her mouth opening in surprise as she saw me walking past her desk with a legal team, a stark contrast to the quiet, self-effacing woman who used to bring Julian lunch and wait patiently in the lobby. I walked directly to the main executive boardroom, where the heavy, frosted glass doors were closed for Julian's high-stakes presentation. Through the glass, I could hear his confident, booming voice presenting financial projections to a group of 5 senior venture capitalists. Standing beside the projection screen was Victoria Montgomery, wearing a tailored cream dress, smiling encouragingly at Julian as he gestured toward a 3-dimensional model of the Brooklyn Tower. I did not knock. I simply nodded to Marcus, who pushed the heavy doors open, allowing our team to walk straight into the center of the room. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his pointer freezing on the screen, his face flushing with immediate outrage as his eyes landed on me. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing here?" he snapped, stepping forward to block the view of the investors while keeping his voice in a strained corporate register. "Security will escort you out immediately if you don't leave this room right now." Evelyn, who was sitting in the gallery corner dressed in her finest silk blouse, stood up with an icy glare, taking a step toward me. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she whispered venomously, trying to grab my arm to pull me into the hallway. "You were told to stay away from family business. You have no right to show your bruised face in front of our clients." I stepped back neatly, avoiding her hand, and looked past her directly at the lead investor, Mr. Harrison, a veteran financier who had known my grandfather for 20 years. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I suggest you pause this presentation and review the notice of default that was served to your compliance desk 5 minutes ago. Vance Capital's primary lines of credit have been revoked, and all development assets under Apex Horizon Holdings are currently under judicial freeze." Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh, looking around the room at the investors as if trying to rally them against a mentally unstable person. "Don't pay any attention to her," Julian said quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "My wife is going through a severe personal crisis and has no authority over any corporate accounts or investment vehicles connected to this firm." Marcus stepped forward, placing a certified stack of legal documents directly onto the center table in front of Mr. Harrison. "Mrs. Vance is the sole trustee of the Sterling estate, which holds 92% of the senior debt instruments governing Vance Capital," Marcus stated deadpan. "Furthermore, an immediate forensic audit has revealed over $4 million in unauthorized personal transfers, which constitutes a criminal breach of loan covenants." The room erupted into quiet, panicked whispers among the board members. Julian's face went completely drain of color, his gaze darting from Marcus to the documents on the table, then finally settling on me with a mixture of shock and creeping terror. He reached for his phone, his fingers frantically tapping the screen, only to find a series of urgent alerts popping up from his chief financial officer, notifying him that all primary corporate accounts had just been suspended by the bank. Victoria Montgomery stood up slowly, her polished composure cracking as she looked at Julian, then at the legal notices on the table, realizing within seconds that the grand corporate empire she thought she was joining was nothing more than an empty shell drowning in debt. Julian took a step toward me, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic whisper as the investors began gathering their coats and files. "Eleanor, what have you done?" he stammered, his confident posture collapsing into a stoop. "What is this absurd game you're playing?" I looked him dead in the eye, letting the cold silence hang between us until the last investor had walked out of the room, leaving only Julian, Evelyn, and Victoria standing amidst the ruined remains of their presentation. "You thought you threw a penniless wife out into the street last night, Julian," I said softly, every word cut like glass. "You never bothered to ask who owned the ground you were standing on, and now every single debt you accrued is coming due at once." The silence that settled over the high-rise executive suite was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the HVAC unit and the muffled rumble of traffic 20 floors below. Evelyn stood frozen near the presentation board, her hand clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles turned white, while Victoria Montgomery quietly grabbed her designer handbag, took 3 steps backward, and slipped out through the double doors without saying a single word. Julian's eyes darted frantically around the room, from the abandoned presentation slides to the thick stack of legal default notices resting on the glass table. The realization that his financial lifeblood had been cut off in a single surgical blow was visibly breaking him. He took a heavy, desperate step toward me, his hands raised in a pathetic posture of reconciliation. "Eleanor, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice trembling as the arrogant facade completely evaporated. "This is all a massive misunderstanding. We were under immense pressure with the Brooklyn site, and I was just trying to protect our future. We can talk about this at home. Just tell your lawyers to pause the freeze for 48 hours so I can sort out payroll." "Home," I repeated, allowing a cold, razor-thin smile to touch my lips. "You had me thrown out of the Greenwich estate 16 hours ago in the middle of a torrential downpour, Julian. You had your security revoke my gate access, and your mother threw my personal belongings into the mud. You don't have a home anymore. The Greenwich property was purchased through a special-purpose vehicle owned by the Sterling Trust, and an eviction notice signed by a state magistrate is being posted on the front gates as we speak." Evelyn let out a sharp, hysterical gasp, taking a rapid step forward with her finger pointed directly at my face. "You ungrateful little snake!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated venom. "We took you in when you had nothing. We gave you a name, a home, and a place in proper society. You think you can just come into my son's firm and destroy everything we've built over a domestic argument. I will sue you for every dime you have, you hear me? I will expose you to every newspaper in the city." Marcus Vance stepped smoothly into Evelyn's line of sight, placing a sleek black tablet on the table and tapping the screen to display a series of high-resolution bank records and sworn affidavits. "Mrs. Vance, I strongly advise you to measure your words carefully," Marcus said with quiet authority. "These documents detail the $4 million transferred directly into your personal account at First National Bank over the last 18 months, labeled as corporate consulting fees. If my client chooses to file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division before noon today, those transfers will be classified as grand larceny and corporate embezzlement." Evelyn's mouth snapped shut instantly. The color drained from her face so fast she looked as though she might faint right there on the polished hardwood floor. She stumbled back against the chair, her hand trembling as she stared at the glowing tablet screen, realizing that her grand lifestyle, her country club memberships, and her pristine social standing were hanging by a microscopic thread. Julian dropped into a leather chair, burying his face in his hands, as his phone began ringing uncontrollably on the table. The screen flashed with incoming calls from his chief financial officer, his primary bank manager, and his personal wealth advisor, each ring sounding like a countdown clock, ticking away the remaining fragments of his former life. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed, bloodshot, and filled with a mixture of terror and deep, burning resentment. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing phone. "Who the hell have I been married to for 7 years?" "You were married to Eleanor Sterling," I replied, standing tall and looking down at him with absolute detachment. "But you were so consumed by your own ego, so desperate to prove your superiority, that you never bothered to read the documents you signed, and you never bothered to ask why my grandfather's legal team managed every piece of property you ever touched. You mistook my gentleness for weakness, Julian. You thought my silence meant I had no voice." I turned on my heel and began walking toward the boardroom doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. "Eleanor, wait!" Julian shouted, scrambling out of his chair and stumbling over his own feet as he tried to follow me into the corridor. "Please, Eleanor, we can fix this." "Don't do this to me!" Marcus stepped between us, holding out a single white envelope containing a formal summons for divorce proceedings on the grounds of physical cruelty, marital fraud, and financial dissipation, accompanied by an emergency restraining order signed by a family court judge less than an hour ago. As the heavy glass doors of the elevator slid open, I glanced back one final time. Julian was standing in the middle of his grand hallway, surrounded by his panicked junior associates and flashing phone lines, clutching the divorce summons like a drowning man holding onto an anchor. The illusion was completely shattered, but as I stepped into the elevator and felt the smooth descent taking me down to the street below, I knew the hardest part of this confrontation was still ahead. Julian and his family were cornered animals now, and a cornered predator with nothing left to lose will always strike back with everything it has. The afternoon sun began its slow descent over the Manhattan skyline, casting sharp, angular shadows across the high-ceilinged office of the legal team. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the concrete jungle below, feeling the strange, calm weight of a storm that was far from over. Julian and his family had lost their primary corporate accounts, but desperation breeds reckless bravery in men who have spent their lives believing they were invincible. Within 2 hours of our confrontation in the boardroom, Julian launched his retaliatory strike. He didn't go through legal channels. He went straight to the tabloids and high society gossip columns. By 3 o'clock, my phone was blowing up with alerts from media outlets running a vicious, carefully orchestrated smear campaign. The articles featured quotes from anonymous sources close to the family, claiming that I was an unstable, vengeful spouse suffering from a severe psychological breakdown, who had launched a hostile corporate takeover to ruin her devoted husband after he refused to finance her lavish lifestyle. They even released a series of selectively edited audio clips from our home security system recorded months ago, taking my quiet, exhausted responses completely out of context to make me sound erratic and manipulative. Evelyn had spent 7 years cultivating relationships with publicists and media figures, and she was using every single contact in her black book to destroy my reputation before I could bring the forensic financial evidence to light. While Marcus was drafting emergency cease and desist letters, Richard Vance entered the office carrying a secure laptop. He set it on the table and opened a folder containing real-time digital surveillance of Vance Capital's remaining offshore accounts. Julian wasn't just trying to win a public relations war. He was actively attempting to scrub the digital paper trail before the court-ordered receiver took control of the firm at midnight. "Look at this," Richard said, pointing to a series of high-frequency wire transfers being executed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under Clara's maiden name. He is attempting to siphon the remaining $6 million of corporate liquid reserves into an untraceable crypto-asset trust before the freeze becomes absolute. He's liquidating everything, preparing to leave the country if the criminal charges land. I leaned over the screen, watching the numbers shift in real time. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with traditional banks, unaware that my grandfather's estate had acquired the primary clearinghouse through which those foreign transactions were routed 6 years ago. Every move he made was being logged on our servers in real time, exposing not just his financial crimes, but the exact network of offshore fixers he had been using for years. Then, my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number, but when I answered, Clara's sharp, arrogant voice cut through the line, completely devoid of the panic her mother had shown earlier. "Listen to me, Eleanor," Clara sneered, her tone dripping with venom. "You think you're so clever with your grandfather's money, but you forgot one small detail." Julian moved all of Arthur Sterling's original personal journals and private legal deeds from the Greenwich safe into a secure deposit box in Jersey City 3 days ago. "If you don't drop the legal freeze and issue a public retraction to the press by 8 o'clock tonight, every single piece of your beloved grandfather's private history will be burned to ashes." My grip tightened on the phone, a cold surge of adrenaline washing over me. Those journals weren't just leather-bound books. They contained the personal memoirs, private correspondence, and original hand-drawn architectural blueprints my grandfather had left specifically for me, the only real physical connection I had left to his memory. Julian had anticipated that I might use corporate law against him, so he had taken the one thing he knew held irreplaceable sentimental value to me as a hostage. "He thinks he's backing you into a corner," Marcus said quietly, watching my expression change as I hung up the phone without giving Clara the satisfaction of a response. He wants to force a negotiated settlement out of court, where you exchange the debt forgiveness for those personal archives. They still think I am playing by their rules, I said, turning away from the window with absolute focus. They think this is about leverage and financial negotiation, but they have no idea that every single step they take brings them deeper into the snare. I instructed Richard to trace the exact physical location of the Jersey City facility, where Clara claimed the archives were stored, while Marcus finalized the formal criminal affidavits. We had 4 hours before their 8 o'clock deadline, but instead of panicking, I picked up the pen and signed the final authorization documents that would hand over the entire forensic package directly to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. At 7:15, Richard confirmed the location of the safe deposit vault, but his next words changed the entire nature of the game. "Eleanor, Julian isn't waiting for your answer," Richard said, his voice grave as he looked at a live GPS tracker on his screen. He just arrived at the Jersey City facility himself, accompanied by a commercial shredding service. He isn't planning to trade those documents. He's getting ready to destroy them right now, to eliminate the original trust records before the federal marshals arrive. I stood up immediately, grabbing my coat as the room fell completely silent. The ultimate confrontation wasn't going to happen in a pristine courtroom or a polished boardroom. It was going to happen in a cold, underground vault in Jersey City, where Julian was preparing to burn the last piece of my identity to hide his own crimes. The industrial basement of the Jersey City vault complex smelled of ozone, motor oil, and old paper. The low ceiling hummed with the high-pitched whine of a heavy-duty commercial shredder parked right next to the open vault door. Julian stood under the harsh fluorescent lights, his shirt sleeves rolled up, clutching a thick stack of my grandfather's leather-bound journals. Standing beside him was Clara, holding a trash bag open, while 2 men in gray overalls monitored the machine's spinning blades. Julian didn't look like the suave corporate titan who had slapped me across the face 24 hours ago. His eyes were frantic, his hair disheveled, and his hands trembled as he prepared to feed the first volume of Arthur Sterling's life into the steel teeth. "Stop right there, Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls, as I stepped out of the shadow of the access hallway. Julian spun around, dropping a few loose papers onto the dusty floor. He let out a harsh, desperate laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Look who finally showed up," he scoffed, taking a step toward the shredder and holding the oldest journal directly over the chute. "You thought you could destroy my family, Eleanor? You thought you could hide behind your lawyers and take away everything I built?" "You didn't build anything, Julian," I replied, walking forward with calm, measured steps until I was standing less than 10 feet away. "You spent 7 years living off a line of credit extended to you because of the very surname you tried to erase from my life. Every suit you bought, every dinner you paid for, and every dollar you siphoned to your mother came from the patience of a woman you treated like garbage." "Shut up," Clara yelled, her voice screeching in the enclosed space. "You're nothing without your old man's money. Julian, do it. Destroy them now." She reached over to snatch the journal from Julian's hand, to throw it into the machine herself. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the books, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up my phone, pressing a single key to activate the speaker. The calm, authoritative voice of Special Agent Davis from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division filled the basement room. "Julian Vance, this is Special Agent Davis with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The premises at 440 Industrial Parkway are surrounded by federal law enforcement. You are currently on live audio and video feed, obstructing evidence, destroying documents under federal subpoena, and grand-scale financial fraud are federal offenses carrying immediate detention. Step away from the machinery with your hands visible." The 2 men running the shredder immediately killed the power switch, taking 3 quick steps back with their hands raised. Clara dropped the trash bag, her face turning pale as she backed into the shadow of the heavy steel vault door. Julian froze, the leather book slipping from his numb fingers and hitting the concrete with a soft thud. He stared at the ceiling, then at the access doors where heavy footsteps were rapidly approaching down the corridor. His knees buckled, and he sank onto a wooden crate, staring at me with a hollow, completely defeated expression. "You called the feds?" he whispered, his voice cracking entirely. "Over a business dispute? Over a marriage?" "This was never just a marriage to you, Julian," I said, reaching down to pick up my grandfather's journal and gently wiping the dust from its dark cover. "You thought physical violence, public humiliation, and financial isolation would keep me obedient forever. You thought you could slap me 6 times, throw me into the rain, and walk away with the rewards of my family's lifetime of hard work." The heavy steel doors burst open, and uniformed agents flooded the space, ordering Julian and Clara to step forward. As the handcuffs clicked around Julian's wrists, he looked up at me one last time, pleading with his eyes for a shred of the mercy I had given him for 7 long years. I turned my back on him without a word, holding my grandfather's journal tightly against my chest, and walked up the stairs into the night air where the red and blue lights flashed against the Manhattan skyline. The morning sun washed over the grounds of the Greenwich estate, painting the slate roof and manicured lawns in a warm golden light. It was the first time in 7 years that the air inside the grand house felt clear, untainted by the suffocation of conditional love and quiet cruelty. In the months following the raid at the Jersey City vault, the dominoes fell with absolute, unyielding precision. Julian's high-profile legal defense collapsed under the sheer volume of forensic evidence gathered by the federal task force. Confronted with undeniable records of interstate bank fraud, corporate embezzlement, and document destruction, he accepted a plea bargain that carried an 8-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant man who had once believed he owned every room he walked into was now reduced to an inmate registration number, his corporate legacy permanently erased from the Manhattan financial landscape. Evelyn, stripped of her ill-gotten funds and facing personal bankruptcy, was forced to surrender her Park Avenue apartment and relinquish her prestigious committee positions. Her public standing, the single thing she valued above human decency, evaporated overnight as the tabloids detailing the financial ruin of Vance Capital flooded the city. Clara was ordered to pay full restitution for the fraudulent advisory fees she had collected, facing years of strict probation and mandatory community service. None of them received violent vengeance. They simply received the exact weight of the choices they had made, stripped of the unearned wealth that had shielded them from reality for so long. I stood on the stone patio where Julian had once stood demanding my complete surrender, sipping my morning tea in absolute peace. The estate had been legally reclaimed and placed under the management of the Sterling Foundation, transformed into an educational center, supporting young women pursuing independent careers in business and law. The house was no longer a gilded cage. It was a sanctuary dedicated to building up those whom the world tried to break. Looking down at the simple gold ring on my thumb, I remembered the cold rain and the brutal sting of Julian's 6th slap. That night had not broken me. It had awakened the woman my grandfather had raised me to be, strong, clear-eyed, and anchored in self-worth. Revenge had never been about destroying Julian. It was about reclaiming my own life, rebuilding my boundaries, and stepping into the light without fear. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, smiled at the rising sun, and walked back inside, completely whole and entirely free. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe to Betrayed the Revenge channel. New video coming soon.